Hey guys, so of course we just had Age of Overlord release and we also had YCS Indie results as well. So as usual, I kind of wanted to go over some of the top decks in the format right now, as well as a cost breakdown of these decks. And of course, cost is always a hot topic in Yu-Gi-Oh, but particularly right now it seems. And speaking of costs, definitely go check out those discount codes. Definitely some cool announcements. We do also have Tier 0 games as well as Card Brawlers. They both have those rarity reprint sets, singles up for pre-orders. And Tier 0 games are they're also hosting kind of like an everything must go sale. So they're doing like really big sales on just a lot of different product. So definitely go check those out and use code Hakuna5 for 5% off. Okay, so let's just start with Rescue-ACE, which of course had the most number of tops at YCS Indy. We do also have YCS Bolivia coming up this weekend, so curious to see how the results are going to look for that one. Just in terms of Dueling Book as well, technically you cannot get this result directly on YGScope. They cannot identify it properly, but you can search for Rescue-ACE Hydrant, and of course had to do some adjustments there. But overall, it seems like it is roughly around the second most played deck with a 61% match win percentage, which is quite high. Now, in terms of the deck list, this is the one that actually won the whole event by Steven Santoli. Of course, another congrats to you, fellow Canadian. And so, overall, this deck did cost about $730 USD. And this is based on the lowest rarity, cheapest price possible for the lowest rarity. And of course, I also want to give a huge shout out to YGOProDeck.com. Really good resource for meta content. Definitely go check those out. I'll have all the links down below. Anyways, in terms of the cost, you'll see that actually, for example, like Pot of Prosperity, that's actually getting reprinted in that rarity set. And it's already accounting for those kind of pre-sale prices. So realistically, a lot of those cards, the price will probably even go down even further once they're actually out, because right now we're basing on pre-order. But of course, at least the side deck, $30, those are that's very cheap. And side deck, you can always make it very affordable. Of course, in terms of the actual deck, though, SP Little Knight, unfortunately, is kind of around $100 USD at the time of recording. And this deck typically seems to play two of those, so can get really expensive if you sort of go with quote-unquote deck core. Of course, what's considered as a deck core is a little subjective. It was also a little bit challenging for this one because I wasn't really sure with all the cyber stuff in the extra deck if that really counts as a deck core. It's not particularly Rescue-ACE, but at the same time, they were worth just pennies, so I decided to add them on there. They're not actually going to make a meaningful impact in terms of this quote-unquote deck core price, but what does make an impact, of course, is some of those new cards from Age of Overlord, like the Diabellstar Witch, which you could argue even some can actually play 2 or maybe even 3, I'm not sure, but at the same time, this particular list just played one that in itself is about $27 at the time of recording. The wanted spells are also $50 each, so that's a pretty big addition to what was already not a cheap deck in terms of Rescue-ACE, because you already have something like Hydron, which I think are like $50 each, and Turbulence have also gone up at about $17 each as well, so definitely can add up for this deck, unfortunately. Now, of course, technically, you don't need the new, Diabellstar Sinful Spoil stuff to play the deck competitively, because, of course, we just were playing Rescue-ACE without those cards up until now, but, like, a lot of people are probably going to want to play this deck optimally as possible, right? And in that case, yes, you do need those Sinful Spoil cards. So next, let's cover Purrely, which is a deck that I don't really want to say got slept on, but at the same time, I felt like this deck did not get as much hype going into the event as it did with, let's say, Tearlaments as well as, Rescue-ACE with this new format. But you know what? The deck is still very good, and of course, showing that it can consistently get tops at YCS level events with the decline in play of, let's say, D barrier that you would see in my YCS Top Cut breakdowns. That's always good news for Purrely players, although unfortunately, the play of Xyz Encore has gone up, as well as, Herald of the Abyss is still seeing some play as well. In terms of deck list, this is the one that finished third place actually, and so this list, $440, not terrible, obviously still a lot from a grand overall scheme of things, but again, you have something like Prosperity, which is about to get reprinted very shortly, so just wait on that on the rarity reprint sets. This deck also has a lot of flex spots, so a lot of that's coming from, like, let's say, just regular staples. Side deck, $20 again. Side deck can be really cheap. This is a YCS level, top 4 kind of deck, and yet the side deck was still only about $20, so from a competitive standpoint, you can always make at least that part of the deck affordable. Now, in terms of the extra deck, of course, pretty much all of these lists, actually literally all of the lists that were publicly available were playing SP Little Knight. So at that point, that pretty much carries the entire extra deck cost for the most part. So if you sort of look at this, quote unquote deck core, $145 honestly is actually not that bad. It is a deck that does require kind of like a big brain to pilot it optimally though. So just keep that in mind. But from a financial standpoint, if you have most of these staples, like the deck core itself is actually quite affordable for Purrely, as you can see even with the extra deck here. Okay, next let's cover Tearlaments, which of course kind of had a bit of a disappointing showing at YCS Indy, but let's not totally write them off yet. I recently also did a meta-analysis of the high-rated players on Dueling Book, and there were still a good amount of Tearlaments there, and actually interestingly enough, pretty much all of them were not on the Horus engine, and as we saw it also at YCS, it looks like that's not really popular with the Tearlament stuff, which I guess from a cost standpoint is actually good news, because the Horus stuff, while definitely those card prices have tanked, it's still not incredibly cheap either. And actually that's a big point I also want to make is, Age of Overlord has only been out for 1 week. Like, if you give it more time, like, a lot of those cards are probably bound to go down, except for maybe SP Little Knight, which, around that $100 price tag is probably, unfortunately, quote-unquote fair / justified in terms of how good it is. But of course, in the overall grand scheme of things, it is still a very expensive card. For Tearlaments, of course, the planets have gone up. Well, I guess technically have gone down and then gone back up. So that is what's kind of like the most expensive out of this deck. And unfortunately, Power of the Elements cards, they did not get a reprint in that recent Megatin, which I really thought, based on previous trends in terms of what sets are included, should have been in there, but it wasn't, unfortunately. So it's still kind of a pricey deck. Of course, from the side deck cost, $270 side deck, that's very, very expensive, but pretty much that is just being carried by, let's say, that Thrust. Like, Xyz Encores are also quite expensive, and surprisingly did not get a reprint in that recent OTS pack that just came out this week, even though, let's say, something like Herald Abyss did come out on the last OTS set, so you kind of thought maybe it would have came there as well. Druid's Room is actually also kind of pricey as well. If you sort of go with, the quote-unquote deck core, unfortunately, Tearlaments is not necessarily all that cheap still. Again, the planets are around $40 each. Cash tier Tearlaments, actually, I think about $15 each as well, so it can really add up. Even the Diviners have gone up as well, about $15 as well. So overall, can still kind of add up, unfortunately. At least the rest of the tier cards are kind of like bulk, just like commons, or realistically not that much, but unfortunately not the cheapest deck. Now, of course, a lot of you might already have most of your tier core from those tier 0 days, which I'm sure a lot of you are part of, fortunately / unfortunately. And so maybe you can brush it off and kick it back again. Of course, it is another big brain deck though. And so, if you're able to pilot it very well, along with a little bit of good luck, you can set up some really crazy boards with this deck and just a lot of layered interruptions as well. So next, let's cover Mannadium, which of course finished top 4 at the YCS thanks to Triff Gaming. Definitely a huge shout out to you. And also Hani topped the event as well with Mannadium. So definitely a really strong combo deck. Droll actually has been seeing an increase in play the last little bit, as you would see also in my top cut breakdowns, but around like YCS Vancouver days, Droll actually was not seeing that much play, so definitely showed people had to kind of respect this deck, because Droll goes pretty hard against this strategy. In terms of the deck list, this is the one by Triff, and of course overall $880, very expensive for this exact particular list. As you can see, like, it has SP, but Barone at least is actually getting a reprint, and again, that is reflected in this price, at least based on pre-order prices. Again, I think that price will only probably go down, especially like the super rare, for example, if once the set actually comes out. But you have other cards, like, let's say, like Access Code is still kind of pricey. This pattern is actually still like $40, and I'm sure like Excel Synchro is still worth something. The Thrust in the side, of course, kind of hard carrying that entire side deck for the most part. So in terms of the deck core though, unfortunately, it is still expensive, although for this one, I'm not exactly sure how to consider the deck core, because, for example, the way Triff played it, he had like the Kashtira stuff, right? Like, you have the Fenrir, the Planet, as well as Scareclaw, Kashtira. So, let's just say we don't include that, because I know Hani's list did not play that stuff. And so in that case, okay, sure, maybe like $240, which still, as a deck core, technically is not necessarily cheap, as at least you would have seen with, like, let's say, for example, Purrely, or even something like the Chimera core, or Unchained, which you'll see shortly, that you would have also seen based on my previous cost breakdowns of, some of the top decks. And so with Mannadium, so unfortunately, the planets are actually kind of pricey, like they're like at least $20 each. Astrolabs are also like $15 each, so it's not like it's not like pennies or anything, but nonetheless very strong deck. And so if you're able to pilot it really well, it's like the best synchro option, of course, right now. And lastly, let's just cover Unchained, which of course is a deck that kind of lost a bit of hype, it seems, especially coming into this event. And of course, it did not have that many tops for this event, but again, not something we can write off. Online, it also saw definitely a notable decline in terms of play, but still doing pretty well, at least among the players that are running it. And also, I'm just covering top 5 roughly, but realistically, the next deck I would have also covered would be Dragon Link, but I've actually covered that deck multiple times in these cost breakdowns, so I figured maybe this time I can just skip it. So in terms of the deck list, this is the one that finished top 32, and you know what, overall $580, sure, yeah, that is definitely expensive, but again, you know, you have cards like, let's say, Thrust and Xyz Encore that's kind of taking up a lot of that. You, again, at least this deck definitely played Prosperities, and now that's going to be quite affordable thanks to that rarity reprint set coming very soon. So now in terms of, you know, sort of the quote-unquote deck core, $116, honestly, that's really good compared to at one point when, you know, a lot of the cards kind of spiked a little bit, but now it's definitely calling back down, considering kind of like the decline in hype as well. So for a tier 1 deck still, like, this is actually still a very good price as well. Anyways, guys, that was it for the breakdown of the top decks as well as a cost breakdown. Definitely let me know if this was helpful in terms of helping you choose the next meta deck to pursue. I'll also be doing this probably next week in terms of, you know, those rogue options. But again, a huge thanks to all of you for watching. Definitely go check out those discount codes for card brawlers as well as tier 0 games to get those Yu-Gi-Oh singles post Age of Overlord as you help prepare yourself for this format. So anyways, a big thanks to my patrons as well for the continued support, and well, take care, guys.